The HOA board thought they were about to crush my disabled daughter Emma in court, silencing her with legal fees and technicalities. They smirked, convinced she had no chance of fighting back. After all, she was just a 19-year-old kid grieving the recent tragic loss of her mother, struggling to hold on to the home they left her. And that's exactly what the HOA wanted. They had been waiting for this moment, waiting for her mother to be out of the way so they could prey on the one person they thought couldn't fight back. They had no compassion, no mercy. They saw an easy target, a defenseless girl they could bully into submission. They were bent on stealing her property, confident that she lacked the means to fight back. But what they didn't know, the girl they mocked was about to dismantle their entire case piece by piece. They walked into court expecting a weak, clueless kid. They walked out realizing they had just made the biggest mistake of their lives. I'm her father, and here is what happened. The tension inside the courtroom was almost unbearable, thick like a storm cloud ready to burst. Every seat in the gallery was filled, occupied by curious onlookers whispering among themselves, their voices a low hum of speculation. Some leaned forward, eager to witness the spectacle unfold. Others sat back, shaking their heads, convinced they already knew how this was going to end. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, casting harsh shadows across worried faces and highlighting the divide between those who had come to support Emma and those who were there simply for the drama. Rows of HOA board members sat smugly in the gallery, their well-dressed attorneys exchanging knowing glances, already celebrating a victory they hadn't yet won. They thought today would be simple, a quick ruling, an easy dismissal of a teenager's desperate attempt to keep her home. The HOA president, Mrs. Caldwell, sat with perfect posture, her designer suit without a wrinkle, her manicured nails tapping impatiently against her leather portfolio. Beside her, the treasurer snickered behind his hand, whispering something that made the others smile with cruel anticipation. At the center of it all stood my daughter Emma, a young disabled girl alone and without resources, standing against a powerful homeowners association that had been ruthless in its pursuit of her family's home. They had no idea what was coming. The heavy wooden defendant's table seemed almost comically large compared to her small frame. She stood beside it, her crutches resting against the edge, untouched though she could have used them for support. She chose not to utter a silent statement that she would not be seen as weak today. Her dark hair was pulled back neatly, her simple blue dress pressed despite the early morning hour it must have taken her to prepare herself without help. Her posture was straight despite her pain, her chin lifted despite her fear. The only hint of her nervousness was the slight tremor in her hands as she arranged her papers. Papers I knew contained months of research, evidence that would soon change everything. Judge Harrison entered, his weathered face giving nothing away as he surveyed the crowded courtroom. His eyes lingered momentarily on Emma, perhaps noticing how young she looked standing there alone, perhaps wondering why she had no attorney beside her. He called the court to order, his gavel's sharp crack silencing the murmurs, and in that moment of quiet, I saw Emma take a deep breath, steeling herself for the battle ahead. Her posture was slightly hunched, the weight of grief still clinging to her. Just months ago her world had shattered. Her mother, her anchor, her protector, was gone in an instant, ripped away by a senseless accident that never should have happened. One rainy evening they had been driving home from dinner at my house, a rare night where laughter had filled the car, where her mother had smiled widely as Emma told a joke, where Emma had felt safe, whole. But then, blinding headlights, the deafening screech of brakes, the violent crunch of metal. A reckless driver speeding through an intersection took her mother. Emma survived, but just barely. The crash had left her with injuries that would forever remind her of that night. Her body healed, but the scars of that moment, of hearing the doctors say, "There was nothing we could do," would never fade. Her mother, Maria Parker, had been the family's backbone, a brilliant paralegal who had worked for the most respected law firm in the city. Maria had single-handedly raised Emma after I moved away for work years ago, making sure her daughter wanted for nothing despite her disability. Now, the home her mother had fought so hard for, the place filled with their memories, was all Emma had left. And the HOA wanted to take that too. Their tactics were cruel, as cold as they were calculated. The HOA had moved the fence line, encroaching on Emma's property inch by inch as if she wouldn't notice. They slapped her with fraudulent violations, a chipped paint fine here, an unauthorized wheelchair ramp there. The infractions were fabricated, the fees outrageous. They assumed she wouldn't have the money to fight back. Court cases were expensive, and their lawyers were among the best money could buy. They banked on intimidation and financial exhaustion. But it wasn't just about harassment. No, they had a bigger plan. The HOA knew exactly what they were doing. They were burying Emma in debt, slapping her with unpayable fines, racking up legal fees she couldn't afford. They weren't just trying to intimidate her, they were setting her up for financial ruin. Because once she couldn't pay, they would strike. A lien here, a missed payment there, then they'd rip the house from under her, selling it off to one of their own at a fraction of its worth. A grieving orphan thrown onto the street while they profited from her loss. It was cruel, it was calculated, and they thought it was inevitable. They weren't after petty fines. They wanted Emma's home, and they were convinced that in time she would have no choice but to surrender it. What was even more painful was the deception from Emma's mother's friends who sat on the HOA board. After her mother was gone, these friends in the HOA, once warm, once supportive, had faded into the background, their loyalty evaporating like morning dew. Mrs. Henderson, who had once brought homemade cookies every Sunday, Mr. Patel, who had helped install ramps when Emma's mobility worsened, the Johnsons, who had promised Maria they would always look out for Emma, all of them now sat stone-faced among the HOA board members, refusing to meet my daughter's eyes. Emma had once believed in those people. They had attended her mother's funeral, hugged her with tears in their eyes, whispered empty promises of support. "You're like family," they had said. "We're here for you whatever you need." But when the HOA came for her, those same people turned their backs. None of them stood up for her, none of them even warned her of what was coming. She wasn't just fighting the HOA, she was fighting a neighborhood that had already decided she had lost. The silence of the community spoke volumes. Some neighbors whispered their sympathies, offered sad smiles, even left casseroles on her doorstep, but sympathy wasn't enough. Emma had spent sleepless nights staring at the front door, hoping just once that one of them would knock, that one of them would say, "You don't have to do this alone." But no one ever came. Not a single one of them spoke up, not a single one of them fought for her. Because in this neighborhood, kindness was silent, but fear was loud. In this neighborhood, the HOA always won. Yet in the face of this betrayal, Emma found strength I hadn't known she possessed. Night after night, I'd call to check on her, only to hear the soft rustling of papers in the background as she studied. "I'm fine, Dad," she would say, but I could hear the determination in her voice, the steel beneath the softness. When I offered to hire an attorney with my limited savings, she declined. "I've got this," she told me with quiet confidence. I didn't understand then. I thought it was pride or stubbornness. I didn't realize she was preparing, strategizing, building a case that would leave everyone speechless. The neighborhood had abandoned her, but their betrayal only fueled her resolve. They thought she was alone and helpless, but they were wrong. They were about to learn just how wrong they were. The lead attorney for the HOA, Jessica Caldwell, sat back in her seat, exuding an air of overconfidence as she adjusted her expensive tailored suit. Her smug smirk hadn't faded since the moment she walked into the courtroom. To her, this wasn't a case, it was a formality, a performance where she already knew the ending. She wasn't alone in her arrogance. The other HOA lawyers chuckled quietly among themselves, exchanging glances like this was all a joke. The board members sat with folded arms, their expressions dripping with amusement. They were already celebrating. This wasn't a trial to them, it was a spectacle, one where they expected Emma to fumble, panic, and ultimately lose everything. Jessica finally leaned forward, her fingers lazily tapping against the polished oak table. Her sharp gaze swept over Emma, her lips curling into something between a smirk and a sneer. "So, let me get this straight," Jessica drawled, her voice carrying the same dry amusement one might use when scolding a child for speaking out of turn. "You actually think you can argue this case on your own?" A few chuckles rippled through the HOA side of the courtroom. Their lawyers smirked, the board members shook their heads, and even the HOA secretary seated in the gallery covered her mouth to stifle a laugh. Emma didn't say a word. She didn't react to the snide remarks, the quiet laughter, the sheer disrespect dripping from every corner of the room. They thought this was funny. They had no idea who they were dealing with. She just sat there, still, silent, watching, waiting. Then Jessica sighed dramatically, flipping through her neatly organized case file with the casual arrogance of a woman who had already won. "Your Honor," she began, dragging out the words as if even speaking them was a waste of time, "let's not waste the court's valuable time here. We all know how this ends. Ms. Parker is in blatant violation of HOA rules, and there is no legal precedent that can save her." She paused for effect, casting a quick glance toward Emma as if waiting for her to shrink under the weight of her words. When Emma didn't react, Jessica's smirk deepened. "Your Honor," she continued, her voice taking on a feigned air of professionalism, "this case is simple. The defendant, Ms. Parker, has repeatedly violated HOA regulations, and these aren't minor infractions. These are direct, documented violations that threaten the integrity of our community's property values. She flicked her wrist, picking up a thick stack of papers before dropping them dramatically onto the table. Jessica produced a series of photographs, each showing minor imperfections that had been magnified, manipulated, and misrepresented. She presented a boundary map that had been secretly altered, moving property lines inch by inch to create violations where none existed. The brazenness of her lies was stunning. She spoke of Emma's repeated defiance and willful disregard for community standards as if these fabrications were undisputed facts. Through it all, Emma remained still, her face unreadable. I could see the HOA members nodding along, confident in their victory, while Jessica concluded with dramatic flair. "Frankly, Your Honor, this isn't even worth a lengthy trial. The evidence speaks for itself. This young woman is desperately trying to hold on to something that no longer belongs to her." Another murmur of agreement from the HOA's table. One of the board members audibly scoffed. Emma simply watched as Jessica leaned back, completely at ease. She had already won. Emma was just a formality, a loose end to be tied up. The problem with women like Jessica: they never saw the storm coming until it was already overhead. Emma had spent months preparing for this. Not for this exact moment. She never planned to stand here alone, fighting for her home, defending herself against people who once pretended to care. But she had studied everything. While other kids memorized pop music lyrics, Emma memorized property law. While her peers played video games, sinking hours into fantasy battles and high scores, Emma played out mock trials in her mind, crafting arguments, dismantling imaginary cases, preparing for battles that no one ever thought she would have to fight. While other kids spent summers at the beach, Emma spent hers in legal libraries. She would sit beside her mother, listening as she dissected rulings, debated legal theories, and exposed the cracks in ironclad cases. Most kids wanted to be artists or athletes. Emma, she wanted to understand the rules that controlled the world. Her mother, seeing this spark, had nurtured it. Every evening after dinner, they would discuss the cases Maria was working on. "What would you argue here?" her mother would ask, pushing Emma to think deeply about legal principles most adults never grasp. For Emma's 16th birthday, her mother hadn't bought her jewelry or clothes. She'd given her a dog-eared copy of Property Law and You, filled with her own handwritten notes in the margins. Those notes had become Emma's North Star, guiding her through the darkness after her mother was gone. In the months since her mother's death, while the HOA thought she was drowning in grief and she was, Emma was also building her case. She had secretly recorded conversations with HOA board members who came to check on her, while actually documenting fabricated violations. She had researched every similar case in the state's history, finding precedents that would serve her well. She had ordered an independent property survey, paying for it with money saved for college. She had even managed to obtain internal HOA emails through a sympathetic administrative assistant who had worked with her mother for years, emails that explicitly detailed their plan to force her out. While her former neighbors ignored her, she dissected every case the HOA had ever won. She studied their patterns, their strategies, their weaknesses. She knew Jessica Caldwell's courtroom tactics better than Jessica's own colleagues did. She had prepared for every argument, every objection, every dirty trick they might use. They thought she was just a kid grasping at straws. They saw her disability, her age, her grief, and assumed vulnerability. They never saw the steel beneath the surface, the mind that could match and exceed their legal expertise. They never imagined that the daughter of Maria Parker, one of the most respected paralegals in the state, would have absorbed so much, learned so well, prepared so thoroughly. They were about to realize just how wrong they were. When Jessica finally finished her theatrical performance, the courtroom fell silent. All eyes turned to Emma, waiting for the inevitable: tears, stammering, confusion. Judge Harrison looked at her with something between pity and resignation. "Miss Parker, your response?" Emma rose slowly from her seat, her movements measured and deliberate. She didn't use her crutches, choosing instead to stand with just a slight tremor in her legs visible to those paying close attention. The effort it took was immense, but the statement it made was clear. She would not be viewed as incapable, not today. Her voice, when it came, surprised everyone. Gone was the soft-spoken teenager they expected. In her place stood someone confident, articulate, and unmistakably prepared. "Your Honor, before I begin, I'd like to clarify something with the prosecution," Emma said, her voice steady and clear. Jessica Caldwell, still lounging in her chair, let out an exaggerated sigh. "By all means," she said, folding her arms, her tone dripping with mock patience. Emma met Jessica's gaze without hesitation. "Miss Caldwell, Just to confirm, your case relies on the claim that the HOA's investigator personally witnessed me violating the property line before issuing fines and penalties, is that correct? Jessica scoffed, barely concealing her boredom. That's right, she said dismissively. And that claim is documented in the official HOA report, correct? Jessica rolled her eyes, already losing patience. Obviously. It's all in the written report, clear as day. Emma didn't react. Instead, she shifted her focus to Judge Harrison, her voice unwavering. Your Honor, I move to dismiss that testimony as evidence. The room went suddenly still. Judge Harrison squinted at Emma, his brow furrowing slightly. On what grounds? For the first time since stepping forward, Emma opened the leather portfolio her mother had once carried to court every day. From it, she pulled a document and placed it on the evidence table. Because the HOA's investigator, Mr. Reynolds, was in Dallas on the date in question, attending his daughter's wedding. She slid forward a notarized affidavit and time-stamped photographs. He couldn't have witnessed anything at my property because he wasn't even in the state. A murmur rippled through the courtroom. Jessica's smirk faltered for the first time. Emma continued methodically, furthermore, I'd like to submit these documents. She placed a stack of papers on the table. This is an independent land survey I commissioned, proving the original property boundaries. The HOA's adjusted line encroaches 2.7 feet onto my property, not the other way around. Jessica half rose from her seat. Objection. This survey wasn't shared during discovery. Because there was no discovery period, Emma replied calmly. The HOA pushed for an expedited hearing specifically to prevent me from gathering evidence. She slid another document forward. Here's the motion Ms. Caldwell filed, citing simple and straightforward violations requiring no extended examination. Judge Harrison's expression darkened as he examined the papers. Emma wasn't finished. She reached into her portfolio again and removed a printed email. I'd also like to enter this into evidence. Her voice remained steady, but there was a new edge to it. This is an internal HOA email sent by Board President Caroline Henderson 3 days after my mother's funeral. The courtroom fell completely silent as Emma read aloud. The Parker girl can't fight this. She doesn't have the resources or knowledge. Keep issuing violations no matter how minor. Once the fines accumulate, we can foreclose and finally get that property. Stevens has already expressed interest in purchasing at auction. A collective gasp rippled through the gallery. At the HOA table, Caroline Henderson's face drained of color. Jessica Caldwell sat frozen, her usual composure shattered. Emma continued relentlessly, presenting document after document, proof that the wheelchair ramp had been approved years ago, evidence that the HOA had selectively enforced rules against her while ignoring identical violations by board members' properties, testimony from the county assessor confirming the original property lines. With each piece of evidence, the HOA's case crumbled further. Jessica attempted several objections, each more desperate than the last, but Emma countered every one with precise citations of legal precedent. She wasn't just defending herself, she was systematically exposing years of HOA corruption that went far beyond her own case. By the time Emma finished her presentation, the dynamic in the courtroom had completely reversed. The once smug HOA board members sat ashen-faced and silent. Jessica Caldwell, her confidence evaporated, frantically whispered with her colleagues. And Judge Harrison, who had begun the proceedings with resigned pity for the young disabled girl, now regarded Emma with undisguised respect. The transformation in the courtroom was palpable. Jessica Caldwell, who had strutted in like a peacock, now sat hunched over her notes, desperately searching for a legal lifeline. The color had drained from her face, leaving behind a sickly pallor that matched her suddenly uncertain demeanor. Her hands, once steady as she dramatically dropped documents for effect, now trembled slightly as she shuffled through papers. The confident smirk had vanished, replaced by a tight-lipped grimace of someone watching their case, and possibly their reputation, disintegrate before their eyes. Your Honor, Jessica began, her voice lacking its earlier condescension, the defendant is mischaracterizing the situation. These emails lack context and... Are you disputing their authenticity, Ms. Caldwell? Judge Harrison interrupted, his tone sharp as a razor. Jessica hesitated, knowing the dangerous territory she was entering. Not at this time, Your Honor, but... Then I suggest you proceed very carefully with your next statements, the judge warned, his earlier neutrality completely abandoned. At the HOA table, panic had replaced arrogance. Caroline Henderson, the board president who had written the damning email, was frantically whispering to her colleagues, her perfectly manicured nails now digging into the arm of the treasurer beside her. "Do something," she hissed at Jessica, loud enough for those nearby to hear. The treasurer, Mr. Stevens, the very man mentioned in the email as wanting to purchase Emma's home at auction, had gone completely pale, his earlier smugness replaced by the look of a man who realized he might be implicated in something criminal. He loosened his tie with one finger, sweat beading on his forehead despite the courtroom's air conditioning. Mrs. Patel, once my daughter's math tutor and family friend, couldn't even look up from the table. Her shoulders were hunched, her expression a mixture of shame and fear. She had betrayed not just Emma but her own principles, and now that betrayal was being exposed in the most public way possible. On the far end of the table, the HOA secretary was hurriedly texting on her phone beneath the table, likely warning others not present that their scheme was unraveling. The younger attorney assisting Jessica was frantically passing her notes, suggestions, anything that might salvage the catastrophe unfolding before them. "Your Honor," Jessica tried again, desperation creeping into her voice, "we request a brief recess to examine these new documents and prepare a proper response." Judge Harrison's expression had transformed completely. The mild-mannered, slightly bored demeanor he'd shown earlier had hardened into something formidable. His eyes, sharp and penetrating, moved from Jessica to the HOA board members, studying each face like he was memorizing them for future reference. "Miss Caldwell," the judge began, his voice deceptively quiet but carrying to every corner of the now silent courtroom, "this court has sat through hundreds of HOA disputes. Typically, they involve legitimate concerns about community standards and property values." He paused, letting the weight of his next words settle. "What I'm seeing here appears to be something entirely different." He lifted the email Emma had submitted, reading portions of it again silently, his frown deepening with each line. "This document suggests a coordinated effort to exploit a recently bereaved young woman with a disability. It implies a deliberate strategy to manufacture violations for the purpose of forcing foreclosure on her home." The judge set the paper down with deliberate care as if it were toxic. "Further, the evidence Miss Parker has presented indicates that your client knowingly falsified official reports, manipulated property boundaries and selectively enforced regulations, all targeted at a single homeowner who had recently experienced a profound loss." Jessica opened her mouth to speak, but the judge held up his hand. "Before you respond, Miss Caldwell, I should inform you that I am considering referring this matter to the district attorney's office for potential investigation into fraud, conspiracy, and possibly civil rights violations." A collective gasp rippled through the courtroom. At the HOA table, Mrs. Henderson whispered something urgently to Jessica, who nodded rapidly before addressing the court again. "Your Honor," Jessica's voice now held a note of pleading, "we would like to request a temporary adjournment to discuss a potential settlement with Miss Parker." It was the first time they had referred to Emma as Ms. Parker rather than the defendant or the girl. The shift wasn't lost on anyone in the courtroom. Judge Harrison turned to Emma, his expression softening slightly. "Miss Parker, are you interested in pursuing settlement discussions at this time?" All eyes turned to my daughter. The HOA members looked at her with naked hope, the same people who had mocked her, belittled her, and tried to steal her home now silently begging for mercy. Emma stood perfectly still for a moment, her eyes moving slowly across the faces of the HOA board members, people who had hugged her at her mother's funeral and then plotted to take her home. When she finally spoke, her voice was quiet but carried throughout the silent courtroom. "No, Your Honor. I'm not interested in a settlement. I would like a ruling on the merits of the case." Jessica Caldwell's shoulders slumped in defeat. The HOA members exchanged panicked glances, realizing their last hope for damage control was slipping away. Judge Harrison nodded, a hint of approval in his expression. He straightened the papers before him, took a deep breath, and delivered his ruling. "Based on the evidence presented, this court finds in favor of the defendant, Emma Parker. All HOA claims are dismissed with prejudice." The gavel struck with finality. Furthermore, the court orders the HOA to restore the original property boundaries at their expense, rescind all fines imposed in the last 6 months, and pay Miss Parker's court costs. He paused, then added, "I am also referring this matter to the district attorney's office for investigation into potential criminal charges against the HOA board members and their legal representation for fraud, conspiracy, and harassment." Another sharp crack of the gavel. "This case is dismissed." For a moment, the courtroom was frozen in shock. Then it erupted. Reporters who had been quietly taking notes in the back row rushed forward, cameras flashed, and voices called out questions. The HOA members hurried to gather their things, heads down, trying to escape the media frenzy. Jessica Caldwell sat motionless, staring at her empty legal pad as if it might offer salvation. I pushed through the crowd to reach Emma, who stood calmly in the center of the storm, gathering her documents with methodical precision. Despite the chaos swirling around her, she maintained the same quiet composure she'd shown throughout the trial. There were no victory dances, no gloating, no tears of relief, just the subtle relaxation of shoulders that had carried too much weight for too long. Outside the courthouse, reporters clustered at the bottom of the steps, microphones ready. Emma declined to speak with them, pulling her light jacket closer despite the warm day. As we navigated through the crowd, I heard snippets of conversations. Neighbors who had remained silent now expressing shock at the HOA's actions, legal commentators already analyzing the case's implications, curious onlookers sharing the story on social media. We had almost reached my car when a voice called out behind us. "Miss Parker." We turned to see Judge Harrison approaching, his robes gone, looking more human in a simple suit. He stopped a respectful distance away. "That was impressive work in there," he said, his tone conversational but sincere. Not many second-year law students could have presented a case that effectively, let alone someone without formal legal training. Emma nodded her acknowledgement. "Thank you, Your Honor." "Have you considered law school?" he asked. "The profession could use minds like yours." A small smile flickered across Emma's face, the first real smile I'd seen from her in months. "Actually, I was accepted to State University's law program before." She hesitated, "Before everything happened. I deferred my admission when Mom died." The judge nodded thoughtfully. "When you're ready, I hope you'll reconsider. And if you need a letter of recommendation, I'd be honored to provide one." He handed her his card. "The courthouse could use more attorneys who understand what justice actually means." As Judge Harrison walked away, Emma looked down at the card in her hand, then up at me. For the first time since her mother's death, I saw something in her eyes beyond grief and determination. I saw hope, purpose, maybe even a glimmer of the future. "I'm not just going to be a lawyer, Dad," she said quietly as we got into the car. "I'm going to make sure what happened to me doesn't happen to anyone else. Mom would have wanted that." As we drove away from the courthouse, leaving behind the reporters and the defeated HOA board, I realized that my daughter had not just won a case, she had found her calling. The people who had underestimated her, mocked her, and tried to take advantage of her had inadvertently helped forge a powerful advocate for those who couldn't fight for themselves. They had no idea what they had just set in motion. It's been 6 months since that day in court, and I still find myself shaking my head in wonder at what my daughter accomplished. There are moments when I look at Emma, studying late into the night, her law school textbooks spread across the dining table, her mother's old notes beside them, and I'm overwhelmed by a pride so fierce it almost hurts. This young woman, who the world tried to dismiss, who faced loss and betrayal that would have broken most adults, showed more courage and integrity than anyone I've ever known. Emma returned to law school this fall, earlier than she'd planned. The judge's words seemed to ignite something in her that had been smoldering beneath her grief. "Her professors tell me she's exceptional, not just in her understanding of the law but in her passion for using it to protect the vulnerable. They don't know the half of it." What the HOA didn't realize, what Jessica Caldwell and the board members couldn't have foreseen, was that they weren't just trying to take a house from a disabled teenager. They were unwittingly creating their own worst nightmare. An advocate who understood firsthand how the system could be weaponized against those who couldn't fight back. Emma has already established a small nonprofit legal clinic that operates on weekends, offering free consultation to homeowners facing predatory HOA practices. She works alongside 2 law students and a retired attorney who read about her case and offered to mentor her. They've already helped 3 families save their homes from situations disturbingly similar to what Emma faced. The clinic operates from our living room for now, but it grows every month. The HOA in our old neighborhood has been dissolved following the criminal investigation triggered by Emma's case. Several board members are facing charges, and Jessica Caldwell has been referred to the state bar for ethical violations. The new community organization that replaced the HOA has asked Emma to help draft their bylaws, an irony that never fails to make me smile. What I've learned from my daughter is that justice isn't always about who has the most power or the most money. Sometimes, it's about who refuses to be silenced, who stands their ground even when everyone expects them to fall. Emma stood her ground. She fought not just for herself but for everyone who has ever been bullied by those who abused their power. If you're facing your own battle against injustice, Whether it's an HOA, a corporation, or anyone who thinks they can prey on the vulnerable, remember my daughter's story. Remember that sometimes, the people others underestimate are the very ones who change the world. Don't let them convince you that you can't fight back. Don't let them tell you that the system is too big to challenge. Because sometimes, justice comes from the most unexpected places. Sometimes, it comes from a young woman with crutches beside her chair and her mother's legal books spread before her, working late into the night to ensure that what happened to her never happens to anyone else again. Sometimes, the greatest strength lies in those the world too quickly dismisses. And that, perhaps, is the most important lesson of all.